This panel, we're going to discuss democracy and civil participation and involvement. We discuss very interesting and important challenges, the geopolitical aspect, the socioeconomic aspect. But these challenges maybe are determined by an internal challenge for the Union, and this is this relates to how much active citizens are, how much they are aware of Europe, and how much they feel Europeans. So we're going to focus on this in the last panel of today's conference. We're going to discuss, to talk about this, because this topic actually can be discussed with your participation. We need to hear your voice. So I would urge you to actively participate in this third panel. Let's have this discussion. I have with me Mr. Teodor Stoychev, who is the head of the representation of the European Parliament in Bulgaria. Also, Ralitsa Kovacheva, she is a journalist and also a PhD student at the University of Sofia. With them, we will discuss the upcoming Euro elections and the democracy and civil involvement through the European Union. What are the institutional deficits and how institutions can reach the citizens? What is the role of democracy? And then we have also with us Rosen, Dimov, who is the CEO of European Alternatives, and he will share with us European Civil Initiative, an instrument that was introduced by the Lisbon Treaty. We'll hear more information about it. And then Galia Kostadinova, she's a lawyer, the Citizens' Rights Office with the European Commission. And she will give examples of how much citizens know their rights, how much they use the opportunities that are provided for them, and whether they're able to effectively exercise their rights. I'll first turn the floor to Teodor. He will start off with the topic You Move Europe. Actually, this is the topic is the upcoming elections, European elections on the 25th of May. Thank you. I have usually the difficult task of talking before lunch when people are already starving, or just after the lunch break when people are full and demotivated. So I'll be very brief. I want to be very interactive, otherwise I can talk for a very long time. One of the things that we're facing all the time is, why is it important to vote? The media keep asking me this question. And I'm really dumbfounded in finding an answer to this question. Why is it important to vote? Or why do we have to think about it at all? But now we have European elections ahead, and we've been trying to show with concrete examples things that we believe are close to the people, to all of us as European citizens, to show through different decisions by the European Parliament what has changed as a result in our everyday life as a result of those decisions. And I hope that our campaign has reached as many people as possible, but also talking about active civil involvement and participation. We have to mention the role of the media, because they have to successfully transform our language into institutional language when we talk about European decisions, and they, or the other way around, they have to translate institutional language into our language. So we've seen many headlines on the newspapers where we read about the decisions which are presented in a very different, in a very twisted way. The example that I can give, there was a report on healthy food at schools, and the European Parliament voted for having more fruit at schools, healthier food, more fruit. And the headline that we saw in one of the Bulgarian newspapers said, the European Union deprives our children of crisps, of chips. And it's very difficult to convince people that it's important to vote for European Parliament, and the decisions that are made are of great significance. Many surveys and studies show that between 65–70% of national legislation is decided on European level, and that's why it's obvious why it's important to vote. On the other hand, when we talk about civil participation, openness to the citizens, I think the European Parliament is the most open institution. All documents to be discussed, they're uploaded on our website in all languages, official languages of the European Union. You can see that there is streaming of live broadcast of the meetings and sessions. So you can actually learn about everything that's being discussed, that's being done. Well, it's another matter whether you're interested in this. But we need the media, first of all, to explain, and we do it as well by sending press releases and explaining what's being done in the European Parliament. The role of the media is very important, and NGOs as well. That's why our communication efforts are targeted not only at the media, but also the different stakeholders. These are organizations that are part of the decision-making process. They're mostly affected by all this. A few words about the campaign. This time we talk about openness, possibilities and opportunities for participation. Well, of course, we have budget restrictions, and this is true of most all member states, and that's why our election budget was very small, 60 million euros for 28 member states, and the campaign started back in September last year. Also we targeted our efforts at online communication. We are very active in Facebook, Twitter, and the idea is to reach younger voters that is harder to reach through the traditional communication methods. A few days ago, a very interesting video clip was published. It's not our clip, but it's by the Danish Parliament. It's a cartoon, very provocative. It's not our product, I have to say. But there are really viral video clips published in the internet, and they were successful amongst young people. I don't know who watches those clips, but the idea is that we have active communication, and we have our colleague here in the audience who works with the social media. So when we set a topic for discussion in Facebook, Twitter, or when we have questions, we try to respond as soon as possible. But we're at least trying to provide a competent answer. Sometimes it's difficult, of course. Our main communication, we'll go back to civil participation. These elections will be different. I keep repeating this all the time, but for the first time, when we talk about direct election for European Parliament, our votes will be important not only for the direction of development of the European Union for the next 5 years, but also most of you have seen sociological surveys. You know, the two leading parties, the EPP, the PS, and the PS, they're very close. And the EPP is the front runner now, but they're very close with the PS. Well, actually, we will elect, what we're going to do is elect a president of the European Commission. This was introduced by the Lisbon Treaty. Although this is not very well explained in the treaty, how should this happen? But we have European political families, and there's a consensus that the four major political parties, actually the party that will have the greatest majority will nominate the candidate for the European Commission, and there's now a schedule for how this will happen after the elections. So I hope that after 25th of May, actually on the 27th of May, there will be the first meeting of the European Council, and the candidates will be presented and discussed. That's why we wanted to give faces to this campaign, to show faces and to shift the debate from the domestic problems to the more European European levels, because we're talking about vision for Europe and how parties think the development of the European Union should, how the European Union should develop in the future. This time the debate compared to 29 the debate is much stronger among the people as well. I don't know whether my friends in Facebook are a good criterion for this, but I can see many of them here in this room. But we've been talking about the quality of debates, the arguments, and last night, actually, there was a debate in the European Parliament, which was broadcast on national television. So when we talk about domestic, we usually talk about domestic problems, but these are maybe the first elections where we're going to talk about the direction of development for the European Union as a whole. And I hope the the voting turnout will be higher. So since 1979, this was we've been witnessing a negative trend. I think maybe somewhere in the 80s there was a slight rise, but the average is 43% turnout. We'll see what will happen this time. I hope it's different. But this is not only a problem, it's a problem of the political parties, their platforms. So I hope that our information campaign reaches the people so people know what they are voting for. That's why we mentioned the informed choice, because it's very important who we send to the European Parliament. And I hope that we will really send people who will protect our interests. And we've been repeating all the time that our members, Bulgarian members of the European Parliament, they should protect our interests. But they have to, after all, they have to work towards the development of the European Union. Not so much the domestic interests. So I'll stop here and I will put this issue on the table for discussion. Yes, you explained the issue about the upcoming elections. Why is it important to vote at those elections? And what was mentioned last time at the last night at the European Parliament debate, that maybe these are the most important European elections, and this publicity that's given to the people, to the real faces, this reaches people in a much better way. But the thing is that we cannot overlook the role of the media, and I would ask Ralitsa whether the mediated dialogue through the media is a more effective form of communication from the institutions to the people, and whether the institutions are closer to the people in this way, to the citizens, or other direct forms are effective as well, and can they develop further? Good afternoon. The European Union communicates through the media with the citizens. This is categorically correct. This is the categorically more effective form because you can communicate with a large number of people at the same time. But that doesn't mean that European institutions should stop all attempts to directly reach people. But this means the communication policy of European institutions should take into account the realities in the landscape. And they're not so bright as you see them. This is at least what I think. Yes, these elections are different, and the message of the European Parliament, but unfortunately the reading, the interpretation of the word different, is very different in Bulgaria. They are different because they are a national state, and this is how we measure the key messages. But this is not news. This is not happening for the first time. But for me, the bad news is that I can see how I can see the European Union, the image of Europe, becoming a stake of supporting points, key points. It's one thing debating about Europe, or whether we want left Europe, right Europe, more Europe, less Europe, do we want Europe at all? And it's another thing when there are concepts are being developed where the European Union is directly associated with kind of new colonialism, the choice between the European Union and Russia, between Europe and Orthodox religion, Orthodox Christianity, and this is something very, very different. And I believe this is dangerous because I've always thought that Bulgaria has never doubted European values. It turns out that it's not like that. We thought that we had a consensus on European Union membership, and it turns out that it's not exactly like that. And all the parties promised to protect national interests in the European Union. I didn't hear any party defining any national interest to protect with a specific policy. What is this national interest, like a fictitious interest, in front of whom, against what? Another mantra, very popular one and a very dangerous one. We will make Bulgaria a full member of the European Union. I see no reason why Bulgaria has not behaved as a full member. Actually, with the exception of the politicians, and I can also, I've been hearing this statement even by journalists that the European Commission has been right-wing so far, and it's going to become left-wing from now on. And this is again not put on the table for discussion. Can the European Commission be left or right at all? Talking about also national interests presented as a stake at the European elections, like the South Stream project. Even the European Commission may make many other proposals, but still this is a very permanent idea circulating around. This is very dangerous rhetoric, because you know that when people do not have enough knowledge about something, they tend to adopt and accept cliches and create stereotypes and prejudice. For example, for and against vaccines in bgmama.com. Since the knowledge of about the European Union in Bulgaria is at a very low level, but I'm talking about Bulgaria in particular. People don't know much. They know very little about the European Union. That's why there's no reason why people would not believe some really drastic thing, and they might really be ridiculous, sound ridiculous to us. And there's one more thing that contributes to this, and it was mentioned by Associate Professor Yulia Zakhariev, and that's the fact that in Europe there is a tendency to use words for the message, not for the content. And there are many things in the treaties or in other documents, and they're very pompously announced. They're not exactly as they are presented. So this creates unrealistic expectations. A classic example of this is European citizenship. European citizenship was thought of and created as a means for people to motivate people, to be inspired, to inspire people to feel European, including with the concept of European identity. So we have a new urge now to institutionally create identity with this, with Barroso's initiative, with the new story about Europe. Again, we have this urge to encourage institutionally the idea about European public sphere. So if we have an European public space, we will solve the issue with the democratic deficit. I don't think this can be created as a cloud. This public space, European public space. But if we take it to be an active dialogue between different national public spaces and spheres, including the politicians, citizens, media, if they interact, if they exchange messages and they argue, this would dramatically decrease this feeling of democratic legitimacy. It's like the weather forecast. It's 20 degrees outside, but it feels like 15 because there's wind. So this is the active dialogue, whether we would rather feel European citizens or rather not. So you know that if people do not really know how a decision is made at the European Union, they think that it comes from above, from the top. Many colleagues and friends we're working with, we're making efforts to explain that in all decisions of the European Union, Bulgaria participates, but the politicians, on the other hand, find it very convenient to say, well, Brussels said we have to cut administration staff. So what is really necessary from the point of view of the media, I think, is the following several things. First and foremost, we really need training we have to be trained to work on European topics, issues, to work with European sources of information, reading documents, working with... This is literacy. The other thing that we are lacking, this news information about what is happening in the other EU member states. Do we know if, for example, in Bulgaria, we are very much excited about agricultural subsidies? Do we know what the Czechs think about this, or whether this is a hot issue in the Czech Republic? Do we know that for 6 months the migration, Bulgarians and Romanians have been the #1 topic in the UK. And I should tell that what the Bulgarian media write, they translate what they read from the British press. They don't provide different data. They don't provide different statistics. Like, for example, 80% of the Bulgarian, the Bulgarian workers the Bulgarian citizens in the UK, they work, they have jobs, and this statistics was actually shown by the British media, not the Bulgarian media. Another thing that we are lacking in this dialogue is that through this dialogue, we should move towards the creation of a European identity, of the collective we, because now we're saying we, Bulgarians, and they, Europeans, or we, the Brits, and you who are coming to Britain. But this is the most difficult part. It's very easy to create identity if you look from the outside. The Ukrainians, they protest because they recognize Europe, and Europeans, they want to be members of the European Union. They don't want to be co-members with the Brits or the Bulgarians. But from our perspective, there's no common European position on Ukraine. And this is not because the European Union is hesitant, but this is because the result of the negotiations between 28 member states. It's not the technocrats in Brussels that should make this decision. We have to decide between themselves, and there's no we. And I will finish off with a story. I remembered it last night while I was watching the debates at the European Parliament of the candidates for presidents of the European Commission, especially Mr. Tsipras. He was particularly inspiring. In 2010, I think it was in June, when the World Cup started. Greece-Nigeria was one of the first games, and there was a meeting of the European Council, and we waited for the leaders to come out and announce their decisions. At the press center room, it was very hot. Somebody turned on the TV to see the football game, and it was Greece-Nigeria. The Greeks scored a goal, and the room was silent, and there were just single screams and cries of Greeks. And then when Nigeria scored, the whole room was screaming. All the people were crying and shouting. Thank you.
Rosen,
you have the floor now. Do citizens break down the cliches and what mechanisms are there to think out of the box and provide new solutions? So we'd like to hear you on this topic. Hello. I would like us to revisit the topic, and I would like to argue here with Ms. Kovacheva and say that we're becoming more European by the day. And MoveBG and the media pluralism initiatives aim at specific results in that respect. I would like to also revisit something you've mentioned as well. The future of Europe is a hostage to the Council, European Council, and that's how it has to be, because the member states use every option they have to retain their sovereignty, and they do not compromise the future of Europe and the European citizens. But at the same time, there are many programs and initiatives within the EU which are building Europe in the periphery, which will one day become the very core of Europe, and then European citizenship would not be secondary to national citizenship. This will be reversed. European citizenship will be primary and national will come secondary, if at all. So, in the area of education, science, sports, and lately the new programs will take time to be implemented. So the Citizen Initiative for Media Pluralism, jointly with the Journalists Alliance and other NGOs across Europe, are working towards this goal. So this is a campaign I've been monitoring for 2 years and participating in it in some form. The fact that this legislative mechanism is provided to citizens does not mean that it's all very easy, because we have a highly fragmented civic society in Europe, and civic initiatives such as these help in or facilitate communication, the exchange of critical opinions. So, for instance, we've brought together nationalists from different countries, and they find it very difficult to communicate amongst themselves. But through all these mechanisms, we're building up more of Europe. And although time is of the essence and there are conflicts, but this allows for citizens to get to know each other, to act. And we're not talking about any massive revolutionary movements. We're talking about specific tasks. For instance, in Bulgaria, there'll be a country tour or a tour in some other country, and this will allow monitoring by a journalist in a small settlement, and this investigative journalist would be investigating the issue in Estonia. And there are digital tools that can be used. There are get-togethers such as the one today, debating keeping track of events. So this is a process which will take time, but Europe is doomed to be strong. If Europe fails, this means every nation state will fail and its citizens will fail. So that which is emerging in the periphery, inclusive of our current Civic initiative, will once again bring Europe to the fore of the global map. So what we did initially was a test by the European Commission to see if we can pass the eligibility criteria. First time we failed. The second time, justifying media pluralism as part of the economic levers, this worked. This interpretation was accepted by the Commission, they registered our initiative, and then we started collecting the signatures. However, it will take time. And as in many other areas, Europe has yet to gather momentum. And the debate we're holding today happens on the eve of the EP elections, so that everybody in this room and European voters will start querying whether those they elect will take into account party discipline, or whether they will be able to go beyond what Europe is at this point in time. So this is the very core of our trans-European initiative. We seek involvement by citizens across the board. That's exactly how we can build up proactive citizenship. National boundaries are still a delimiting factor, and they are the barrier to the success of all of us in this very challenging world today. Well, we've heard that borders still exist and that it is down to citizens to determine how we surpass these borders. What can we do to help citizens cross these borders on a daily basis? So, Galia, you have the floor. As I listened to the presentations by all the panelists, I was thinking that perhaps if we're invited to discuss the EU in 20 years, we would be discussing democratic deficits again. Probably 20 years ago, people were discussing the same issue. The paradox is that every time there are European parliamentary elections and every time the parliament obtains more competencies, we get more worried about the democratic deficit. So the more people are directly elected, the more we do get concerned that the European Union is drawing apart from citizens. So these concerns are partially due to the fact that we compare the European Union to the national state, and it's not the nation state. And such parallel processes that we discern at the national level cannot be found in Strasbourg or Brussels or Luxembourg. Democracy cannot be the the same on the national and the EU level. Within the EU, I don't think that we could break down the fragmented public space which Ralitsa Kovacheva mentioned. I don't believe that in the Netherlands they care who Dejan Pejevski is and who has nominated him or what the quality of education in Bulgaria is. So we have to accept this. And as soon as we acknowledge it, then it will be so much easier for us to determine the role of the EU and to what an extent it's good for us and to what an extent it can improve our political system. And before I actually delve into what the European Union is providing for citizens, I'd like to draw your attention to all the topics we've been discussing. How are they being used politically? Internally, and every time a politician is successful, he says, we made this, we did this, we built this, and when they fail, they always point a blaming finger at Brussels. This is not a Bulgarian discovery. This has been happening in the EU since its inception. Every member state does that. So the citizens' perception is important. So, as I say all these things, I would like to share a democracy theory, the input-output democracy theory. And it is posited on the fact that the state of affairs in a democracy has to do with representation, but the democratic nature of a system is determined by the level of participation of citizens in that system. So the political system has to defend the interests of citizens. And if we analyze the European Union from that vantage point, that is what it gives us, how it changes us, then this democracy debate would shift a little bit. It will move to an entirely different level. There are two very important issues that need to find an answer if we want to find out if the EU is democratic. And we have to look at the competences of the EU. So the question is the EU capable of defending our citizens' rights as soon as we leave our nation state, once we move into the larger European environment? And secondly, if we're still within our nation state, if our rights have been breached, would the EU be capable of defending us? So these are the two levels, the two layers which are interlinked. So we have the prohibition on discrimination, the protection of our rights abroad, and the protection of our rights within our nation state. So I think that will determine how democratic the EU is. Let's look at the first question. Without further ado and further theorizing, I will say this. If we have a Bulgarian citizen who has traveled to the UK, and there were debates whether additional restrictions should be imposed on the travel of Bulgarian citizens or the issues of Bulgarian university students and their ability to hold a job and grants. And, a lot of explanation are expected out of London, and Brussels wants London to explain the situation, and there are very few explanations sought out of Sofia. So there is a more intense exchange between Brussels and London, and less of an exchange between Brussels and Sofia on these matters. Prime Minister Cameron responded. I don't know whether he responded personally, privately, or through the papers, but Brussels was the effective player who intervened on these matters, so the restrictions were revoked as of January 1st this year. So if Brussels wasn't there to intervene, if this was just a bilateral agreement, would Bulgaria have been able to defend its citizens' rights? Probably not. So Brussels guarantees citizens' rights. That's your answer to whether the EU is democratic. And let me mention a few more cases and point. We keep receiving alerts by Bulgarian citizens who've been employed in Greece and are retiring there. It takes them 2 to 3 years to process their documents until prior to receiving their retirement package, and it takes another couple of years before they actually have that money disbursed. So they write letters to the European Commission. And Bulgarian citizens in Cyprus, who are a huge community there,
населението там, имат огромни затруднения да си изкарат
да си изнесат в България помощите за безработица. Все още го има този инстинкт за протекционизъм. The protectionist instinct is still very much alive, and the national authorities act out of the perception that the Cypriot government should not be funding foreigners, but these foreigners have actually been paying social security contributions, and they've actually contributed. And Bulgarian institutions are incapable of helping anyone, so they have to write letters to Brussels. So are people aware of their rights? They find out. What they don't know is what do they do once they run in aground because of protectionism. And they believe that by writing to the European Commission and Brussels, they will finally reach some closure. We are European citizens, we live in Bulgaria. What can the European Commission do for us if our country fails to resolve our problems? Let's take an example. An act is adopted in Bulgaria which restricts our right to purchase land simply because we spent 2 years prior to the purchase in France, because that's where we found a job. Can Brussels protect us against such a law? Because such a law should be declared to be in prejudice or to prejudice the EU acquis. Now, if you want to pay your health insurance contributions retroactively, there is a law which protects you from having to pay those contributions twice. So there is protection for our rights. And in a democratic system, you have rights, but you also should have implementation. So if a country breaks the rules, then Brussels can impose sanctions. So the rule of law in Bulgaria is not an immature phase. Those measures are important. So the issue of democracy and participation should remind us of something else. Even before there were elections for European Parliament, citizens have participated in European integration. This is an evolutionary process. That evolution is due to citizens and the court in Luxembourg. All of us who work in the area of the European acquis, for instance, litigation against Andrea Frankovic is a citizen, Tony Kroll is a citizen, they've all sued companies, they are participants in the legislative process simply because they have sought recourse, they have sought remedies when their rights were breached. So the extent to which citizens can protect their rights are pinned upon the rule of law. And the rule of law is probably more important than voting in the European parliamentary elections. And I'll stop here. I have many questions which our panelists have to address. They've also posited a lot of other questions about democratic legitimacy, and that's why I'd like to ask you something. If we're talking about democracy and participation, we cannot overlook questions and answers. So, do you have any questions? Would you like to make a comment? Hello, my name is Lilia Lenko. I represent the National Youth Forum. It's an example of a citizens' initiative. It's a national organization. We're members of the European Youth Forum, the only ones. I was really provoked by what Mrs. Kovacheva said. So because of that, I have a number of questions to pose, and I have a few comments to make. I personally believe that the biggest challenge in Bulgaria is the abuse of media power. Why? Because in my view, in Bulgaria, there is no distinction between opinions and facts. There are journalists, colleagues, who make no distinction between the two. So, by using the most powerful instrument for public opinion, they serve up opinions as a fact, and then they wonder why these opinions are accepted as proven facts by the audience. I distrust the motto that those who don't know are not guilty. Libraries are open to everyone who is willing to read, and I believe that our mass education system makes people at least literate. And there is a huge challenge in citizens' education, because we're explaining to our citizens what it means to be voting, and that's your first task as a citizen, because when you vote, you're in power. And what do you do when you hand over your right to empowerment to somebody else? So our education is focused on making people literate. And you said something which provoked me. You said that there are certain people who bandy about ordinary things, and we come to conclusions. I'm not quoting you word for word, but you said, how can you draw conclusion just on the basis of commiserations? And we draw conclusions about Bulgaria and Europe. And you say we should be very critical when we access information, and then we have to find out whether what we're being provided with is facts. Journalism and our journalists have the task of collecting different points of view, analyzing them, and then presenting them. And then individuals should be in a position to think. And that's the big challenge that citizens face. And we shouldn't be wondering in 20 years' time what Europe is. May I ask you to be brief? Because we are indeed behind schedule, and we hope to have a dialogue. Okay, then I'll ask you a question. I'll address that question to you because you're the moderator. Every now and again, I enter that role. How do you achieve good communications? Because Mrs. Kovacheva said something about the messages that are sent out there and how citizens interpret those messages. Institutions should take care of that. So what is your understanding then? Maybe I'll address this to Mrs. Kovacheva. How do we understand whether we've done a good job in communicating and whether our messages have been properly interpreted? I thank you for what you've said. I think I understood some of what you said, and I agree with it. And citizens or individuals should not be considered as innocents abroad. Of course, everybody is under obligation to educate themselves, and we know this doesn't happen. So from that point of view, we cannot be over-optimistic in expecting citizens to be able to put together the big picture on their own, given the media environment in Bulgaria, where there is no distinction between facts and opinions. Myths and legends are dished up. So it's very difficult for the Bulgarian citizen to find their way around the factology in the EU. I'll give you an example here. I noticed this piece of news in a Russian website, which I came to by chance looking for something, and I was drawn by the provocation in the heading. And it said the European Union is discarding nationality. And I found out that Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, the president of the Commission, has said that there is no need to have a national identity. Everybody will have an European identity. That's why we have to forget about our national belonging, our nationality. And there were a lot of sarcastic comments, and there were a number of quotes from statements made by Herman Van Rompuy. It turned out that this was a speech which he delivered in Berlin at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there he was talking about European identity, but he had said nothing about the fact that we will no longer be British or Bulgarian, whatever. And I forgot about this, but then I found this as a piece of news on a Bulgarian site, and they had copied the Russian heading, which was nationality thrown away, and the quotes were also discarded, which at least were correct. And it said the European Union is beginning to look like the Soviet Union more and more. So this is an investigation which every Bulgarian citizen has to make in order to find out the sources of information, the facts that are being quoted. So I'm drawing your attention to this because the media are a very important player, and maybe I've been misunderstood. I have not said that tools such as yours for direct citizen participation are important, but I'm saying that there have been polls and surveys which show that 80% of citizens find out about the European Union and any other event from TV. So we need to focus on the media when they are creating myths and stereotypes and legends, because this is very dangerous, and that's why I mentioned it. I believe that the Dutch will never have to find out who appointed or nominated the Lampevsky, but there has to be a dialogue between the different states. But what I meant was that European topics which are important to us should be brought to the attention of our citizens so that they can form an opinion about them. I see there are a lot of questions coming up, so let us start with the first question.
Hello, I'm Vladislav from Blueprint. Sorry, I'm taking the floor again. My question is to Mr. Stoychev and Ms. Kovacheva. We can adapt it to the Bulgarian context. How can we bring back the discourse of political issues in the sphere of the reasonable, the common sense? Because I think it's taken out of this sphere, but and it's brought into the sphere of the irrational and emotional theories of conspiracy and so on. So in the context, this is in the context of European elections, but not only. Thank you. I don't know. We cannot really direct the political discourse because we don't have powers in the institutions. The people who are the face of the institutions, they have to do it. What we are trying to do is to be very specific, very concrete. We don't use emotional messages and appeals. We always talk about concrete solutions, problems. And sometimes we may try to be more emotional to avoid being boring, but what the politicians are doing, this is their own business, this is their own problem. I cannot really comment on this, but sometimes the emotional aspect works. For example, I would be emotional when I talk about Strasbourg and Brussels. Every time I travel a day and a half to reach Strasbourg, it's really very inconvenient, but at the same time it's a symbol of the reconciliation between France and Germany. So this is at the core of the modern European Union. So if we are too technocratic, we become very boring bureaucrats. So we need to find a balance. I agree with Theo. Yes, I understood your question, but I think emotion is not always a negative part of the discourse, including in the election campaign. A recent study was published. I don't know whether it was published in Bulgaria, but it proves actually that the main component of the feeling about European identity is food and music. And this is a very emotional argument. So from this perspective, we cannot build identity without emotion. But going back to what you asked, to me, there's no other way to take the political discourse out of where it is, unless we use two ways: the media and the citizens. The journalists should ask sensible, reasonable questions, rational questions, and not to repeat just political ideas instilled in their heads. And also the citizens, they should vote, they should be seeking their rights. So if the politicians are emotionally attacking us the way what you meant in your question, when the voters vote emotionally, yeah, this will be okay for them. I can see there are many other questions. We're running out of time, so let's hear the questions, and then we will have a short answer session. Thank you. I'll be very brief because we mentioned communication and how citizens are interpreting the messages by the European institutions. My name is Ralitsa. I work I deal with communication of the European Union. That's why I'm involved in this. So I want to ask a rhetorical question. Are you aware how often, very intuitively, we actually replace the two words European Union with the word Europe? And are you aware that these two concepts are different, very different from each other, geographically, historically, emotionally even? Europe is a very different thing than the European Union, which is perceived as an institutional whole. And going back to the question about communication, this is the big problem that all of us who work with communication, with communicating what the European Union is doing, this is the big problem we're facing. I'm aware that maybe this will sound outrageous for many of you, but what the European Union does not give, is not giving to the citizens, is clear direction. In the treaties, it is stated that the European Union, the European integration, are moving towards a tighter, a more united union. From the point of view of the communicator, this is an impossible message. People need clear messages, a clear goal. The European Union has not yet answered the question where is it going to? And this is an important question for the building of a public image of the European Union. So please finish off your comment. The second thing I want to pay your attention to is that, again, from the point of view of communication and in connection with this very significant difference between Europe and the European Union, there's another problem. And this is the diversity, which is a favorite term for European institutions. Diversity from the point of view of geographical perspective, diversity is an advantage, but is it so from an institutional perspective? Can this diversity can be harnessed within the institutions to implement, to serve institutional integration goals. So from the perspective of this craved institutional unity, Europe has not yet built its communication identity. So before we we shape this identity, unless we have this identity, we cannot have a real public debate, pan-European campaign. And for the first time now, at this election campaign, we from a communication perspective, we are now seeing the beginnings of something like European identity, because the important topics are clear. The important topics for the European Union, and also the political parties identified more or less the same topics, and also this debate personified through the presentation of the candidates, the nominations for President of the Commission. Thank you. Yeah, I would answer you, but there are other questions as well. Dimitar Bechev, Director of the Sofia office of the ECFR. I want to say something about the fragmentation of Europe and European identity. Fragmentation is inevitable, and we can say at least that the 28 member states have different understanding of the balance of power and markets. So these things are negotiated on a national level. We cannot have a mega consensus on the European level, because we have different answers for the different societies, and there's nothing bad about it. The European Union, after all, is how can we manage this diversity and live together, coexist together. So the horizontal aspect of the citizenship, crossing borders, protecting rights in other member states, this is actually the governance of the European Union. Before the direct elections, before all this, we have free movement. So this is where we should seek the meaning of the European Union as a system that guarantees the rule of law. But the question is that this horizontal aspect is connected with the vertical aspect in order to effectively protect our rights through the borders. EU institutions should be legitimate. And my question to all of you is how serious this issue is, the fact that less and less people are voting, those that are motivating by parties that want to block and block the European Union and break the consensus, or the vertical aspect, citizens towards Brussels, and how this harmonizes with the horizontal aspects, the single market and the human rights. Hello, my name is Borislav Sandov, co-chair of the Greens. Very briefly, I would say that I have very positive experience with the civil participation on the European level, much better than the Bulgarian institutions, although it's a slow process. It's a real process as stipulated in the documents. But in terms of democracy, there's a question troubling me. One of the basic principles of democracy, these are the elections. We are having stronger and stronger European Parliament because of the Lisbon Treaty, and we were a member state when this treaty was ratified, so we participated in the improvement of democracy in the European Union. Nevertheless, different member states don't have the same standards, and that's why the candidates from different countries are not put on equal footing. And, for example, the far rights are very critical about about the standardization in terms of access to participation in the elections and the common standards. And the other thing that I wanted to outline about the media, because yes, they have a key role not only in the communication between candidates and voters, but in the whole campaign, and I have to share with you that during a campaign, and I'm one of the candidates, we're like suffering from leprosy. They say, okay, we want to talk to someone, but we don't want a candidate in the elections. We don't want to talk to a candidate in the elections. This is discrimination. This is what the medias do and want. We think this is unfair. And also those paid advertisements. They don't care whether Volen Sidorov really got a medal or bought a medal or some piece of jewelry or something. I'm interested to know about democracy, election democracy in other member states, whether this, and on an institutional level, whether this is very brief comments, please. Now I would ask the panelists to comment briefly, and then I can see more hands, raised hands. So 2 more questions. We'll take 2 more questions at the end, but let's comment briefly on what we heard so far. I will go first. First, there's no institution of the European Union that is a painkiller for everything. That provides an institutional framework of the European Union that can pursue and protect all the interests and the rights of the people. That's why we combine different democratic forms, including participation in European institutions. So this provides an added value to European democracy. We also know that one of the proposals of Democracy International, where the Greens participate as well, is to initiate an European referendum, first to change the framework of the European Union so that citizens can directly participate. And after this amendment to the Lisbon Treaty, this should be turned into a practice, regular practice. And also, there is a proposal from the Spinelli group, the Audi MEP, who defends the idea about transnational lists. And 80 MEPs supported this idea not to have national lists with the different, and to have competition between the European parties, but no, to have a list like of the European Greens, that this list guarantees that we will have MEPs participating who will represent transnational interests, and all this altogether can guarantee better quality media, better quality public debate. But I think we need civil participation everywhere and more coordination with civil platforms and initiatives to backfire to the national institutions. Andrew Duff is the MEP. Yes, this is an example. I'm talking about equalization. When we talk about European standards and election laws, well, in this case, it was not about legislation. It was a report on their own initiative that proposed things towards common European lists and standard rules for European laws. This report, I remember 2 or 3 years, it could not be approved. It not go through the voting in the plenary commission, plenary session. So similar decisions like this are always blocked either in the Council of Ministers. Nobody would try to add rules that need to reach a compromise between the countries that require the countries to give up some of their national sovereignty. And talking about the legitimacy of institutions that have to protect the rights of the people, I think it's the task of the Commission. This democratic legitimacy has it's a multi-layer concept. The governments, they are elected through national elections, and the commissioners, they are nominated by the national governments. So we boiled out to the question, what can we do to make people vote? So there's a decline in everywhere in the voting turnout, with the exception of the countries where voting is mandatory. And the two most legitimate institutions, because they're directly elected by European citizens, these are the Parliament and the Council of Ministers, but this goes for the Commission as well. I hope we will not revert the trend of these elections, but we'll see. And it's not going to be a dramatic change towards higher turnout. Just two things. The way you asked your question shows the problem in the European Union. Diversity on the one hand, each country has its own rules, but on the other hand, we need to have some standard procedures, rules for equal footing, and this is resolved every time, case by case. The crisis of trust, of confidence, this is part of the economic and financial crisis, and it's difficult to overcome it. And about what you asked, you said that the media don't want to interview candidates for elections. Well, this can be clearly seen. I cannot explain why this is so. Maybe what's seems most logical is that our law is very restrictive, and the media, they have to drop all political news from their news broadcast, because they are not allowed to show the candidates, political candidates. And this is no good, because that means that the campaign turns into a series of election broadcasts where we can see parties getting together, people getting together in some cultural centers. And unfortunately, this is because the media say, okay, let's have paid broadcasts instead of free broadcasts. Vladimir Schmitzer, who used to be a Liverpool football player, he is now a candidate at the elections. I want to bring in some emotion to this dialogue, discussion. I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said, I'm an intellectual mover, like moving. I work for a moving company. But my question is, why do we avoid the problems about aesthetic, about artistic values? And I will make myself clear. We all know about Byron and Christo Botev. Byron wrote a poem of Don Juan, and Christo Botev wrote a poem called Hachi Dimitar. And my question is, in which cluster will Bulgaria be through the European index of the catch-up index? In the European catch-up index. Very short comment. Professor from Michigan noticed that there were two words in the statement. The statement was about the European Union, that it has to protect the interests and rights of the citizens of the European Union. It's very important to underline that the European Union and any other institution can protect the rights of everyone at the same time, but it's impossible to protect the interests of some groups without violating the interests of other groups. For example, the agricultural subsidies. This is at the expense of making other people work and becoming slaves of those who get the subsidies. So it's very important not to insist on some institution protecting someone's interests. Rights, yes, this is the legitimate role of each and every institution, but interests can be protected and pursued only voluntarily through the market. This is what I want to say. I want to thank everyone for your contributions and comments and questions. So I would like the panelists, I would ask the panelists to make some final comments. 30 seconds. We're well behind schedule, and then we'll wrap up. So, messages or open questions? I'll vote on the 25th of May. I wanted to say the same, but talking about the interests, those interests are represented when we talk about European parliaments. There are lobbyists pursuing different interests. So it's really we have to pursue interests and also protect rights. There should be a balance. We cannot pursue just interests. There are agricultural subsidies. And I want to go back to what Ralitsa said. It's important that we vote, and we should know who we vote for and what we vote for. I also talked about rights and interests, but I think it's about choice of terminology. Before becoming it's an interest, then becomes rights. The right to agricultural subsidy is not a fundamental right. Anyway, this was from me. I would urge you. There are also public interests, and they also need to be protected by public institutions. This is their main role, to protect public interests. You don't agree with me? The role of public institutions is to protect public interests.
Благодаря за пример.
I would encourage you not to theorize about Europe, but to work practically in such venues with the participation of other European citizens from other member states. They're also a very good example about how Europe can be created. And I would like to thank MoveBG for their efforts to taking us all together under one roof in the name of a common vision for Europe. So I would
I'll use the next 30 seconds to appeal to you to participate more actively in this initiative. That's the message that MoveBG is sending out. Now, I would like to invite the moderators of the other two panels, but I would like to thank the panelists in this last panel, first of all, and then we'll move on to the closing. In the last section of our conference now, we will summarize the preceding panels and questions which drew our attention. Sasha, you have the floor. I will revisit what Rosen and Dimov said in closing. It's more important to create Europe rather than theorize about it. And we have tried through different formats in the past 3 months to give a practical dimension to EU membership. Europe must be understood and it must be put into practice. This gives Bulgaria many opportunities which have no alternatives, and these are not theoretical alternatives. Today's conference was an attempt to outline and bring together viewpoints on 3 very important aspects of European development: the geopolitical dimension, the socio-economic dimension, and civil society, civil participation, and democracy. We have the 3 moderators of the 3 panels here with us, and I would like us to summarize now the very important positions which were voiced. Hopefully, we'll be able to structure them into messages which will be representation within the EU in the future. So, Adelina first. Well, this was the second panel. I noticed something not only during the panel which I moderated with pleasure. It is that there is a thirst for debate about the EU, not only because we lack knowledge and understanding, but because we need to be vocal about it, to realize what it can and can't do. It's another thing when it comes to what we want the European to do or not do. The election campaign, which is ongoing, has been posing that question in a way. I modeled the Common Foreign Policy panel, and the conclusion was that this was just a wish list. We would like to have one, but we don't have it. And we heard very interesting theories about energy policy in particular. There were debates about the use of the right terminology, whether the European Union is a dwarf or not. And I think we asked more questions than we got answers. That leads me to conclude that organizations such as MoveBG must continue in organizing such debates. In some parts of Europe, these are debates which have been going on for months or more, and they're usually very specific. I also noticed that we mentioned the complexity of the discourse. When we start talking about Europe, it looks to us very complex. We should not turn our backs on complexity. We should try to unravel it, not to have to go back to grade 1 every time and ask the question, do you know what the EU stands for? And try to educate our journalists, because this is something we've done before we even acceded to the EU. Obviously, this isn't bearing fruit. So the media are not the only ones who provide information in the 21st century. There are other ways to do it. So, given my foreign policy panel, I can draw the following conclusion. The more we speak about Europe, the more we will see it as our own, because one day the treaties will be opened up for amendment, so we have to be clear about what we need to change, rather than once again elect somebody who will represent us in a convent, but because these people use very boring language, it will not sell papers, and that's why we opt for something which is easiest, and we turn on a music channel. So we're talking about a common foreign policy, but the question is, do we have a vested interest? Should it encompass energy as well? Is enlargement part of foreign policy? And all sorts of issues like that. So that when the 12th hour strikes and we have to vote, we're here in Bulgaria, we'll be able to say, we in Bulgaria, the citizens whom we represent, are of the opinion that. So this is what I can conclude about our panel, and I thank you for being active participants in it. During the first panel, I think we could hear the same messages. We heard about the catch-up index, and I really liked the picture that was shown. Tiny little pieces of a puzzle which produce a big picture. And although the different countries are developing at different rates, there is convergence and cohesion in Europe, although it's not as good as we expected it would be. So the European Union is operational. And there was something else having to do with the catch-up index. This union is operational, but responsibility is still a national responsibility. The only guarantees we have is that if we change our fundamentals in the economy, then we can be more prosperous. By and large, Evgeny mentioned that despite the difficulties, the EU is well positioned in the world scene. There were 50 billion, so the economies obviously are working well, and the competitiveness of the EU is not a governmental function, it is a corporate function, a function of innovations and businesses which are innovative. And then there were two more commentaries, namely that Europe, social Europe and Europe of austerity should be well balanced if we want to develop. And then the banking union was mentioned. Its advantages and disadvantages were mentioned. And the good news is that future crisis can be avoided. What made me happy about this discussion was the ability to listen to all the panelists, and it's very good to have this debate in Bulgaria. This was not a Bulgarian debate, this was a European debate, and I felt like a European because Bulgaria is within the EU, and we did not delimit ourselves to regional or national issues, something which has been happening lately. So I thank you, and I'm very happy we're all here. I hope we'll meet again. And then we all have these badges which read, "I am voting." I suggest that you give those away to people who are still hesitating, because at least 50 more people will be voting. Well, you've been listening to me until a while ago. I had the honor of moderating the last panel, which posited fundamental issues, just as fundamental as geopolitics and socioeconomic aspects. It had to deal with democracy. And we had memorable messages. Everybody focused on communications, and that communications has to be two-way. It cannot only come out of institutions, but citizens should also be participating and should be accessible. It should be more interactive. It should involve citizens more, but to do that, citizens should be well informed. So it's a two-way street. And to me, that's one of the messages today. These are the messages of the last panel. Democratic participation, citizens' participation is necessary. We need to know our rights, and we need to seek ways to protect them. There also was mention of something that needs to happen. We need education on European topics. We need to be aware of what's happening in other member states. We need to create a European identity through the means of dialogue and debates and discussions and roundtables and open communication helps in informing citizens and having them make a commitment. I too have a badge which says I'm a voter, and we don't need to cajole us into voting. It's important for everyone to participate in initiatives, to launch initiatives, because if we're better informed, we'll be more active. It's a two-way process, so get the information and get involved. That's my message to you.
Our European
campaign aimed at a better understanding of Europe, but speaking about Europe and building up the road we want to traverse. I don't know whether we've achieved our ambitious goals, but I'm happy and I'm satisfied, and I believe I speak on behalf of the MoveBG team. We brought together people who have the interest, who have a position and a vision of how Bulgaria should develop using the EU instrumentalities. We had a very good exchange today, which lays the ground for a more pragmatic dialogue about our European path and finding solutions to our Bulgarian problems. We at MoveBG would like to bring together divergent positions and seek consensus and solutions. And I trust that the format we've opted for, that is openness and transparency, introduces a communication standard which is all-inclusive. I believe that by making a concerted effort, we will promote Bulgaria's developmental path through the capabilities we have as a community. You probably are all aware that Bulgaria's development is our duty, and the processes, the painful processes which are underway today, both privately and on a nationwide scale, is like a purgatory which will free us of old molds which are trying to find roadways in our society. So we need to work together so that Bulgaria will be a democratic European state, but a state of weight, a state which has an active position, and every one of us should have a proactive position. So let us vote, let us elect the most deserving ones who are in this political race, and let us hope that we will be motivated to vote, because Bulgaria has the chance to be governed by professionals and people who are responsible vis-a-vis our national cause, and they will fit the profile of the people in this room. So stay abreast, stay in the loophole by visiting our website. You're welcome to our MoveBG home, and we trust you're all part of our community, and we hope to be part of that community in Bulgaria which can change Bulgaria.
Благодаря ви още веднъж на всички участници, панелисти, модератори и на всички присъстващи.